I don't know if everyone saw it. There was an article in the New York Times about Trump supporters and about Trump himself. And it's a series of articles, a number of written by Tom Etzel, but others as well. And the gist of it is, this particular article and what they're just making reference to is that Trump supporters are not just the marginal, poor, uneducated, unemployed whites. It's happening across the board, and in fact, based on some research, the support is greater among well-off, upper middle class whites, which is interesting because that was also true of the Tea Party. And people forget that there's this narrative around, people losing jobs and they don't have health insurance and whatever, and that's why they're supporting, that's what's driving people to Trump. And it's not that that's irrelevant, but it's not the main driver. It's actually much broader than that. And I think the reason that that's important is that if we're, in many ways, trying to solve the wrong problem. And that's especially true, I think, among, without being disparaging, liberal white Democrats. So they really want to make the issue around mainly economics and jobs. And to some extent, they also sort of, their foil is the cultural war or identity war. Basically saying we got to stop focusing on identity and these marginal issues that blacks or Latinos or Asians or, excuse me, gays and lesbians, and really focus on the hard bread and butter issues, which translate into economic issues. And a really positive, powerful example of that, of course, is Bernie Sanders, who eventually got around to talking about race, but begrudgingly. I had some relationship with the Sanders campaign and advised them about the need to talk about, quote unquote, identity issues, that they only came to late. And again, seeing as the big issues. And those of you who know my writing will know that I suggest that the big issues are also identity issues. That politics is almost always about identity. And there's a book called Belong by Sapolsky. And he makes the observation that many struggles, and including many wars, have been fought over symbolic, sacred symbols. Not necessarily material, but sacred symbols. And he says sacred symbols are much more important than we acknowledge. And every group has a sacred symbol, even if it doesn't recognize it as a sacred symbol. So you can imagine one sacred symbol in the United States is guns. And I really do think guns is a sacred symbol. It means something beyond what the physicality of guns. Guns certainly don't provide protection or all these other things. It's a symbol for something else. And we could guess what that symbol is or try to figure out what that symbol is. So then what's going on? If the economy is not driving Trump supporters, what is? And I also want to come back and I assume, maybe wrongly, but most of the people in here are not Trump supporters. If I'm wrong, I can leave now and enjoy my lunch by myself. So there's a flip side to the Trump supporters, and that is that, and this wasn't covered so much in the article, but so Trump represented an attack not only on blacks and Latinos and Muslims and gays and anyone who doesn't fit some kind of narrow normativity, but he also represented an attack on normative institutions like democracy, like voting, like law and order, like separation of powers. Many of our institutions that we have actually taken for granted. What I want to suggest is that the liberal, or not even liberal, the left actually has a similar, not the same, but a similar antipathy toward those institutions. We tend, from our perspective, to be overly cynical. We actually wrap it up in radicalism. So oftentimes young people refuse to vote because they think it's buying into a corrupt system. And this is not just the phenomena in the United States. Kavita's here. The program we're running is anti-black racism, addressing anti-black racism in the United States and South Africa. You see a similar phenomena in South Africa, and I would dare say in many other parts of the world. So what's going on that these phenomena are expressing themselves differently, but expressing themselves in Europe, in India, in Asia, in Latin America? What's going on? Well, I want to suggest a few things, and then maybe after a few more comments, have a discussion. Again, the received wisdom is that there's economic uncertainty, and that just simply doesn't hold. It's not that economic uncertainty is not an issue, but it's not the issue. And it's at best one among many issues, and I would say the issue is something else. So what do we find present in all of these expressions of right-wing populism, right-wing nationalism? And one is this pernicious framing of the other. And along with that, the populism is kind of authoritarianism. And so it's the idea of a strong leader that somehow is not hamstrung by either norms himself, and he usually is a man, and it's some contradictions. And when you look at things, they're almost always contradictory, because the literature on authoritarianism suggests that what generates or what releases authoritarian tendencies is attack on norms. And yet these leaders themselves are attack on norms. So it's not a straight line. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So Trump will say, I'm not an ordinary leader. I'm not an ordinary politician. And so you always hear this, like, people are tired of, traditional politicians. They wanted something different. And so, it's like, so a neo-Nazi, oh, that's different. How about, but it's difference in a certain direction. It's not a progressive difference. It's a difference in terms of redefining a very narrow, usually either religious-based or race-based and gender-based heteronormity leader, right? So it's not saying if you could have a revolutionary who would be different, but it's not, and it's almost always based on a fictitious past. So it's like, let's go back to, and of course there's no going back to. There was never a time that past actually existed, but these are issues that actually activated at a cultural and a psychosocial space, so it's not historically relevant. So if you were to go back and say, well, no, that's not accurate, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't shift people's position at all, because there's something more fundamental going on. You may say, well, what's more fundamental than actual history or facts? And there are a number of things. One is ontological grounding, which is a big word. A more available concept is our spiritual grounding, our sense of meaning and purpose. People need to have meaning in their lives, and not individual meaning, but collective meaning. So, so what Trump really represents is the anxiety that conservative whites feel about this space and time in our history. So much so that they're basically saying, can we stop history? Can we turn it back? Now again, it's not a straight line, because no one's saying, I'm going to become an Amish and I'm not going to use electricity and I'm going to give up my cell phone, I'm not going to drive my car. So it's expressed along very particular lines. Thomas Friedman has written a book called Thanks for Being Late. And he wrote the book because he said a lot of times when he's at a cafe and he's waiting to interview someone and they come late, and his life is so busy that when someone's late, he has a minute to himself. So instead of a person coming saying, I'm sorry I'm late, he's saying, no, I'm glad you're late. It gave me 5 minutes to catch my breath. But in this book, he argues that we're in a time of accelerated change. And what he's playing on is the idea that we can only process so much change along important dimensions without creating a crisis for us. And he's saying that the amount of change that we're having to process is accelerating. And there are interesting factoids, and I'll come back to my central thesis in a minute, but one of those interesting factoids is that in Europe and the United States, where the highest number of robots exist per capita, tends to be the most reactionary. So that there's a relationship between robotics, maybe, and people having reactionary politics. Now again, but no one's saying we should stop having robots. You know, so when they say build walls, no one's saying let's build walls and keep the robots out. You know, it gets framed in terms of people. So the through line, so we have change in terms of globalism, change in terms of the political economy and global politics, change in terms of the speed of change in terms of technology, the way we do our lives, the way we organize our lives, all of those changes. And then one of the changes that's most salient is the change in terms of where people live. By some accounts, there are probably close to 400 million people who are living outside of their home country, and the number is growing. So now, it's not any change. It has to be change that's important, change that actually, in some ways, is disruptive. And there's no, so you may ask, what is that change? It's not given. There's no natural change. We don't know beforehand. We don't know, literally, the human organism, probably all organisms, can only change so fast before they become destabilized and even die. But the social change that we're not going to be killed necessarily by a cell phone. Although it is interesting that, again, an interesting factoid, last year was the highest number of killings by sharks in human history. Did anyone know that? You say that was interesting. Well, maybe not. But here's something even more interesting. Last year, more people were killed by selfies than killed by sharks. So there you have it. Keep away from your phone and the beach. So it's sort of interesting because for those of you who watch movies, if I just hum the tune, right, da na 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 na, you're going to think Jaws, right? And so there are all these movies about you got to be afraid of sharks. So the number of people killed by sharks last year, by the way, was 15. Right? Exactly. It's just creating some fear in your mind. In fact, interesting. What's the most deadly thing that kills humans on the planet?
Humans.
What?
Humans.
Other humans? No. What? No? Anyone else? Mosquitoes. And yet there's no horror movie about mosquitoes, right? Literally hundreds of thousands of people die every year because of mosquitoes, but just not that interesting. And of course, most of those mosquitoes are someplace else. So I'm trying to tie all this together to suggest that we have to manage change, we have to have a story about change, we have to have a narrative about change. And what the change is actually representing is two things in a way, and they're related, but they're not the same. One thing is, what does it mean to be human? And the other thing is, who are we? It's who are the we? So you could say, in a sense, every national story, every religious story, is a story about a story about who is the we, who are the people. And so there's the social theory, and there's sort of three divisions for this. One is bonding, that is, which actually means you like your own group, you bond with your own group, your family and your immediate extended family. The other is bridging, which means you relate to people who are not in your immediate family. And if you do that at a deep level, you actually end up creating a new family. So when you relate deeply to, people, they actually become your people. They become the new we. You enlarge the we. And you think about hunter-gatherers. An average hunter-gatherer tribe was about 200 people. So it used to be that our families or the we was never larger than 200. Modern society, now people think of being French or American or Christian or Muslims, and so it's thousands, millions of people who in some way we have some social connection to. And then the third is breaking, where there's a group that's not your group, and they're perceived as a threat to your group. And the threat can be on multiple levels, but the most severe threat, I would argue, is the ontological threat. So that threat is actually more pronounced than economic threat. If you think someone is going to actually destroy who you are, not necessarily kill you as a person, you may still exist, but your purpose of life, your definition of life, your spiritual grounding is gone. So as you know, there was just a vote in Italy, and the major issue from the popular right was to stop the Islamophobia of Italy. So it wasn't more jobs, it wasn't austerity, it was very specific. Now, there are a lot of people coming to Italy who are not Italian, but it wasn't saying stop the Germans from coming. It wasn't saying stop the Brits from coming. It was saying stop the Muslims from coming. So it had a particular focus. So again, it's not change writ large. It always is more particular than that. Who is defined as the threatening other? So a couple of things. The implications for that, for us, is huge. Right? It means that, and the fragmentation and polarization that's going on is actually quite important, but actually also is misnamed. Because the way the press covers it is that the left and the right are polarized against each other. And then when you're polarized against each other, it's like there's an equation, right? It's that if it's like Fawn doesn't like me and I don't like Fawn, so we don't like each other. Actually, I love Fawn, so she loves me, so we love each other. But anyway, the point is that it's basically saying it's equal on both sides. So we have to sit down the Trump supporters and the Trump detractors. They're somehow of equal value. And actually, that's not right. It's not right for a number of reasons. It's like saying the Nazis and the Jews just have to sit down and learn to get along. Well, the Jews weren't saying, let's kill all the Germans. It was the Germans who were saying, let's kill all the Jews. And there was a power differential. And so to just perceive it as polarization or tension between two groups is misunderstanding what's going on. And now, notice that the attack on groups is also an attack on institutions. So it's not just attack on blacks or Latinos or Muslims, it's attack on democracy, it's attack on voting, it's attack on the courts, it's attack on our structures. And most people don't notice how those things are related, or they misunderstand the importance of it. And I'll just say a couple of things and I'll stop. One explanation is that those institutions are solicitous toward the other. So why don't I like the courts? I don't like the courts because they've been captured by blacks. Now that was the rhetoric in the 70s after the Civil Rights Movement, that blacks had been able to capture the courts. The Warren Court was perceived as a black court. And so Nixon ran with the promise that he would take the courts back. Notice the language, takes the court back and remove it from civil rights. He appointed 4 justices, and in a sense they ended the civil rights movement in law. And we're still living with that. The 2 other pieces to that. What people didn't realize though is that taking the courts back from civil rights gave them to corporations. So the courts became really instruments of neoliberalism and corporate power. Those two things go together. Again, most people don't see those things as related. So what does that mean for us here at Haas Institute? What does it mean for you? Well, so here's what I think the challenge is, and I think it's quite big, I think quite important. If this continues, this right-wing ethnic white populism or religious populism, I think not only will be an attack on anyone who's perceived as not normal or embracing the norms that are articulated, but it'll be an attack on all the institutions themselves. That's internally, but externally it also be an attack on, so it's not a coincidence that the United States is solicitous toward Russia and picking a fight with China. And I think it's partially racial and partially religious. Russia is seen as both white and Christian. China is not white nor Christian. And we'll tolerate Japan and all those other countries because they're supplicants. And what's most threatening of China is China refused to stay in its place, to recognize the dominance of the West. And there was a New York Times piece about 3 years ago saying we're heading toward a period where the first time in over 350 years, the world's leader in terms of the economy and maybe even culture will be a non-white, non-Christian country, meaning China. And the implication, it didn't say it, and it said basically, you should be afraid. How can the world be led by a non-white, non-Christian country? This is before Trump. But there's already this anxiety about, there's this order to the world, and China is threatening the order. And they're right, China is threatening the order. And part of it, China is saying the order is, it's not whites don't get to dominate, Christians don't get to dominate. So here's the challenge. It means, in a sense, we have to actually be about constructing a larger we. And the tendency on the left, liberals, not liberals, but more on the left, is to construct small we's, and maybe even try to use those small we's defensively to guard against the Trump kind of vitriolics. But we do it in a way that actually makes it impossible for us to succeed. So for example, if we say all whites are Trump supporters, we just, it's probably about 26% of whites. So what happened to the other 74%? We just lumped them all together. We can't distinguish between the Trump supporters and the non-Trump. They're all whites. And even go smaller. We say, well, it's, they're not. I'm concerned about Muslims. I'm concerned about African Americans. I'm concerned. So my we becomes small and fractured. So here's my prediction: if that continues, that we don't survive. That we will literally have endless wars. We will destroy the planet, and the world as we know it, and maybe humans simply don't survive. Now that may seem like hyperbolic and exaggerating, but it's not. If you think about the EU, the reason Europe moved to the EU is they said, with a bunch of little countries fighting over resources, within less than 50 years, we've had 2 wars, 2. And so part of the integration of the EU was to, can we do something to create a larger we? Can we create a European identity so we can stop killing each other? Because each war becomes more deadly. And the capacity that existed in World War II is nothing compared to the capacity that we have now. So our challenge then becomes, can we, both at a structural and institutional level, create institutions that support the governance of a pluralistic but people who are connected across cultures, religion, whatever indicators we think are important, or not. And right now, for the most part, I would say we're not seriously engaged in enterprise except to oppose Trump. So we don't realize how we are complicit in the enterprise ourselves by, one, refusing to think about what are the institutions for a large, diverse, connected society, and how do we then create relationships that support a larger, more inclusive we. So I'll stop there and get your thoughts and comments. Yes.
I was just interested by your comments about how EU, the whole movement toward unification was a movement to create a bigger EU. I'm not sure how that framework could be used in the context of the US, since the way that I see the EU integration is that the people race-wise are more homogeneous, or like they all share the same explicit or racial identity, so that makes it easier for them to integrate into a unit. Whereas in the US, culturally or racially, there is such a divergence across the country. So do you think, to what extent can we learn something from that, from the EU approach to unification? Is that even remotely helpful in terms of how we structure our approach to creating a bigger?
Okay, great. A good question. So there's a book written by a professor at Harvard called, the name of it is, What Difference Does a Difference Make? And the point is that there are no natural differences. And similarly, there are no natural similarities. So if we go back to when France was starting to become a country, there were several different quote-unquote races or tribes in France. Most of them didn't speak French, and most of them didn't think of themselves as French. The fact that they were all the same phenotype was irrelevant. It's only in retrospect that we say they're and now, of course, whatever, we have France. They actually constructed a people. There's a book by Anthony Marks called Making Race, Making Nations. And so, again, in the 19th and 18th century, or even before, right, Europe didn't exist as a space. Europe is an idea. There's not a physicality to Europe. It's actually constructed. And when it's first constructed, it's constructed because there are all these different people who are organized. Samuel Huntington's written a book called Who Are We? And he argues that we're settled by, he said we're a settler society, not a immigrant society. And we're settled by two groups. And the two groups, Huntington argues, were the Anglos and the Saxons. And everybody else, if you are from the islands or from Britain, if you're not Anglo or Saxon, you're of a different race. The fact that you have similar phenotypes is irrelevant. Think about the war in Ireland that's been going on for a very long time. Think about Rwanda, Tutsis and the Hutus. It's like they literally are the same genetic stock, and in many cases the same religion, but at the point that they decide to divide, not only are they dividing, they decide to commit genocide against each other. How would they even recognize that this person is the other? And sometimes they did it by the number of cows you had. And so, and again, your question is a good one, but it's important to recognize that differences are themselves socially constructed and the meaning of difference. So there's not really homogeneity in Europe. We can think of it as homogeneous. So why would the Germans and the French and the English literally killing each other? They saw themselves as a different race. They saw themselves as radically different. They saw the other as not human. And now when they're successful, then they can say, by comparison to the Chinese, or by comparison to the Muslims, we're the same. Not really. I was talking to someone and I was saying diverse cities in the United States, and you may or may not know this, but one of the most diverse cities in the United States, and this was a few years ago, San Francisco. And a person looked quizzically and said, "What do you mean?" I said, "It's the most diverse city in the United States." And I said, "Well, very small black population, only a few Latinos." "What do you mean?" They have, so as you know, 60% of the world is Asian. And it's an incredibly diverse population. To an American, except for maybe Indians or maybe Nepalese, all Asians are the same. So Chinese, and of course, one of the reasons that China respected Mao so strongly is that he unified China. China is the huge country, and it's extremely diverse. Now it's diverse with all Asians, but it's very diverse. Different languages, different religions, different cultures. So again, both the homogeneity and difference have to be thought about in a little bit more complicated ways. And I don't think, at least, and I talk about this, I say the challenge for othering is not saming. So you don't get a homogeneous, you don't get a country that's working well just because everybody's the same. In fact, I don't even know what that means really. But it's like how we talk about sameness and differences and how we relate to each other and how we are in a dynamic engagement with each other. The last example of this, in the United States, or in California, by some accounts now, either by 2020 or 2025, half of the family formations will be interfamilies, meaning that someone in the family will be of a different race or ethnicity than someone else. So that literally, this is 40 million people, and by 2025, half of the family formations will be at least one person, with people marrying someone of a different ethnicity or a different race, or adopting a child of a different ethnicity or different race or different religion. And these are family structures. These will actually create new families and probably new identities. And we actually don't talk about that. But people don't say, well, you know, adopting this child is different than me. How can they be part of this family? It's like, no, it actually changes the whole family. I was talking to my sister-in-law the other day, and I'll stop at this. And she's white. And her daughter, my niece, just graduated from college, and she was adopted from China. And someone was offering my sister-in-law a job in Sebastopol, and my sister-in-law wouldn't even consider it. It's like, there are no people of color there. And so her sensibilities, and I'm not saying every white person, other white people wouldn't say the same, but to her, for her family formation, it'd be inconceivable to go live in an all-white area, right? Because, so in a sense, you could say her adopting my niece has actually changed who she is and her sensibilities. And I'm probably saying more about her than she would like, but when she's a little older now, but when she was dating, that would be a filter in terms of who she would date. So she wouldn't date someone who wasn't comfortable in that kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic environment. So it is a challenge, but it's not resolved or exacerbated, at least in some respects, by homogeneity or heterogeneity.
So my question loops back a little bit to the last section, where you also talked about this, like the bridging that Nelson Mandela did with the general. So the thing that I've been thinking about is how, like, I feel like it's impossible to bridge with someone who on some level doesn't shift, right? So like it can't be that, okay, so Nelson Mandela and that general. Like Nelson Mandela could not have the effect that his bridging would not have been a success had the general not chosen to pursue the treaty, right? Like I don't know if we would have referred to it as bridging if historically that decision hadn't happened. And so I have two questions. So the first piece is this: it's like, how do we, what is a way to think about bridging that like brings that in? Because I feel like, remember when you mentioned how like, oh, we feel like as people of color we feel like the burden's on us. We can constantly bridge, which is definitely true. But it's like, so how do I talk? Like, how do we think about that? Like, how do you talk about that? Where it's like, where we can say like, no, the burden is not like to simply just like bridge, like, and you're just putting yourself out there, but it's like that you're actually calling on the other person to like, to change. It's on some level, it's a belief in like everyone's humanity, but on some level, it's also an expectation that you may not, you know, that person may still like not, you know, not want to stop murdering people.
That's right.
So that's the first thing. The second piece is about this, like the constructing of the we, and you mentioned this too, like in a lot of political theory, it talks about how like when you want to identify something, you're always identifying something in opposition to something, right? Like the Orient, I was like in opposition to the Occident, like by understanding the Orient, you understand the Occident. How do you construct a we that doesn't have an, like that doesn't have an other?
Right.
And again, like I know that you said you don't want it to be that we're like saming, but even in that context of difference, I say all of us in this room, like we can expand our notion of we to include all of us, but there's still some level of opposition. Right. And I'm so sorry, there's a part, the second part of this question.
Yeah, 2 questions in 3 parts.
I'm so sorry. But it's, so that's like the identity piece of it, right? Like how we think about it, but then there's also, for me, like the political question of like, I personally cannot build a we that includes Zionists. I cannot personally include a we that includes like someone who wants to murder me or anyone who's in my we, right? Like for no reason. So that idea of like building a we that also takes into account that there are people that like you don't agree with. Does that make sense? Like without eliminating opposition.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, that's all.
So I have 3 parts to your answer, your question. No, so great questions and really important questions. So there's in a lot of subtlety. So you can't, in terms of building a bridge or reckoning, so there's a slightly different thing. One is like recognizing someone's humanity, and the other is having a certain kind of relationship with that person, right? So those 2 things are related but not exactly the same. So building a bridge or being open to a bridge or recognizing someone's humanity doesn't mean 1, you agree with them, 2, they're going to agree with you, or 3, that you're going to be friends with them, or even, so if you like, if I recognize someone's humanity and they don't recognize mine, what do I do with that? So here's a break. In the United States, and it's probably true in many parts of the world, but it used to be, before Trump, they said 15% of Americans believed in social dominance. I think they were talking about whatever, because you would think that number might actually be higher if you think about it in terms of gender. But whatever the number is, there's some percentage of Americans believe they have the right to dominate others. Well, to me, that's a non-starter. You don't have the right to dominate anyone. You certainly don't have the right to dominate me. And I'll oppose that very strongly. But in opposing it, can I do it without denying your humanity? You're errant human. You're maybe but you're still a human, right? Whereas if you think about like what Trump is doing when he talks about the gang from Mexico or the woman who just got kicked off the program, she wasn't saying, I disagree with Obama, I'm going to oppose his policy. She's saying, these people are apes. They're not human. And I think the challenge is, obviously, she should have lost her job, but she should not lose her humanity. Now, she is actually denying your humanity, and so it would be very easy for me then to deny her humanity. That's what I'm saying. No, don't go there. So yes, you can protect yourself, and if someone's killed, anyway, so that's part of it. Also, in terms of bridging, we have so little practice at it, and Takia was talking about this earlier. So we start with the most difficult. Start with the easiest. Start with the person who. I mean, it's subtle in so many ways, right? I mean, literally, I moved to from Minneapolis to Columbus, Ohio, to teach, and this black guy who had heard of me, he came up and he said, "So I was talking to some black people in Minneapolis, and they said you're you're a bad dude, I should work with you. And this is actually the guy who's head of the Urban League. And I said, so we talked, he said, but then they told me, you ain't really black. And I said, well, he said, yeah, he said, yeah, you vegetarian. But he wasn't joking, right? It's like, you know. And we worked together, and I don't know if he ultimately thought I was black or not, but but we break in so many ways, right? So the extreme, I have a friend, Pastor McBride, and he always says, do I have to bridge with the devil? I said, no, don't start there. Don't start at the hardest, most difficult one. Start with the easiest one. Start with the vegetarian, and then work up from there. And as you start, I think we'll find this it actually changes us in some interesting ways. At a deep level, I would go so far as to say, wherever we break in a strong way, in an ontological way, not necessarily in a political way, in an ontological way, it's where we actually are showing the limits of our humanity. That it really is ultimately about, can I actually, as Gandhi said, can I become human? Can I become humane? And there's interesting stuff. I mean, sort of some of the Western philosophers say that to respect someone means that you punish them appropriately. That actually punishing one is actually it's appropriate, not viciously, is actually a sign of respect. And to your question about does someone have to be outside? This is a debate that's been going on for a long time. I think the answer is no. But we don't know. But and actually, I was just walking across campus to get some coffee or hot chocolate, and I was stopped by a couple of people, and they're probably still out there. They're asking people where they're from, and then they had stickers and they place it around the world where you're from. And they said, so where are you from? And I said, Detroit. And I said, so where are you from? And they tell me, the guys, I guess, from Kentucky, and the woman's from Alaska. And then I said, so why are you doing this? And they say, oh, we're Christian. And we are trying to get people from all around the world who are to sort of engage in the Christian faith. And they said, can we ask you your religion? And I said, yeah. And I said, are you Christian? I said, no. And they said, are you atheist? And I said, no. And they said, are you agnostic? And I said, no. And they said, so what are you? And I said, well, it's funny you should ask, but I have to get back over here and talk to you guys. And I said, I think the world needs a new religion, and that's what I'm working on. And they said, oh, well, you come back and talk to us, and probably won't. But my point is that part of what we can do is we can't live without categories, and categories by their nature include and exclude, but we can make the categories multiple and porous. And I think one of the most interesting and exciting things in this area is recognizing our internal multiplicity. Now there's some work already on this, so the people who tend to be authoritarian tend to have the most difficulty recognizing their internal multiplicity. But then you look at people who are gender fluid, or people who, and all of us, right? It's like, because our identities are situational, we go to different situations, our identities shift. So Zora Hurston basically says, I only became a black girl when I became around white girls, right? Other than that, I was, something else. I was something, but I wasn't a black girl. And so part of the thing is, can we begin to actually appropriately engage our multiplicity? I think if we do that, it actually creates a different empathy for others, right? Because the others is already in me. I can imagine myself in different roles. I can see different parts of myself, parts I like, parts I don't like, and who's the I that's liking and not liking. So I think this is a long journey, but I think given the way that the world is becoming smaller, I don't think we have a choice except to figure it out. And I was serious about a new religion, because religions have given us meaning, but they gave us meaning largely when we were separate from each other. So I could have a world religion in Detroit without ever leaving Detroit. And it's only when I left Detroit that I realized the people in Chicago had a different world religion. And they were making universal claims and claims about all eternity, just like me. And that kind of hard edge have no room for real engagement. And we talked about Kavita is here helping constructing a curriculum with Takia and Stephen, and we talked about the difference between debate and inquiry. That inquiry requires that I really listen to you and understand you to some extent, not fully, because you never understand one fully, but I really pay attention to what you're saying. Where debate is where this is my position, this is your position, boom, boom, boom. So what's happening in the world today is a lot of debate and almost no inquiry. Yes?
I have a question, thinking back to our first day in orientation when we were talking about targeted universalism. I didn't have that language until reading on that and starting this fellowship. And before, I thought that those ideas were equity. And I guess my question is, when thinking about doing like equity work or now targeted universalism work, I feel like often what we run into is that when there aren't enough resources or there's perceived to not be enough resources is when there's that break. And so you're like, oh, okay, I can think about why, this particular group that I view as an other might need this resource, but if I also need a resource, then it's threatening to me and I don't want to play. And so how do you respond to that, or how do you navigate that when it's perceived that there's not enough resources for us all to win?
Yeah, it's a good question. A few things. What I'm suggesting, the reason I started off by talking about the lack of the inadequate for economic scarcity explaining Trump is that it's clear that the planet produces enough to feed or clothe or shelter the whole planet. Now, we don't do that, but we have enough. We certainly have enough here in the United States. And yet, first of all, we're not doing it. And secondly, if that was driving what we're talking about, then the narrative that is these poor white people in Appalachia and in rural who are supporting Trump, and it makes sense from an economic perspective. But then what about the wealthy white person is doing just fine? Why are they supporting Trump? Are they, and it's two things about this. One, what this change produces a certain degree of anxiety. Anxiety is unlimited. In other words, it's not like, if you have 2 cars, you're not anxious, or if you have 2 houses, you're not anxious. It's what the Buddhists call the hungry ghost. You can never feed it enough. It becomes a state of so you have to sort of come at it a different way. There's a lot of writing suggesting that in a quote unquote mature capitalist society, a mature healthy economy, doesn't have to be capitalist, people use stuff as a badge of membership. And the conservatives sort of miss this. They say, what do we mean poor people in the United States? Everybody in the United States has enough food to eat. Not true, but what they're saying is that everybody has enough stuff. Even poor people have a television. That's literally what the conservatives say. The most important good, and I've written about this, is not stuff. The most important good is membership. And what people are trying to do with stuff is buy membership, and they're being denied membership. And so think about it, like when people say, why do you need this $100 pair of sneakers, Air Jordans? Because these other pair of sneakers don't buy membership. I'm not cool if I show up with, Converse. Nobody wears, I'll never have a date, and we need to belong. And so the thing is, can we construct these things? So abject poverty and abject lack of stuff is important, but that's not necessary. And I haven't seen it, but the movie about, based on a true story, John Paul Getty, when his son was kidnapped. I don't know if you remember the movie, or and Getty was right here in the Bay Area. But anyway, and he at the time, he was the richest man in the world. And a true story, his wife the rest of his family's like, they're ransoming the son. They're saying they're going to, and they'd like to cut off his ear and send it, and we're going to kill him unless you give us $1 million. And he had billions. And he said, I'm not doing it. And one of the things he said, you're the richest man in the world. You can afford $1 million. He said, I don't have enough. And he said, I still need more. And his idea was that no matter how much I have, He said this, it's not enough. It's not enough. And in that sense, and that's partially the scourge of the United States, and it's like we never have enough. We never have enough. Because what we're really after is not stuff, we're after something else. We're looking in the wrong place. And that's why I say also this is partially a spiritual thing. It's not just a material thing. So I think if we can recognize our connections to each other, first of all, we're already much better off without any more stuff. And so if you look at all the medical stuff, medical journals, people who live the longest are people who belong. Real simple. And there's a book called Happiness for All. And the author sort of looks at longevity and a bunch of things and well-being, and she has some terms, I forget the name of it, I was on a panel with her. And it tracks economic well-being up to about, I think, $150,000 or whatever. So people who have more money are better off. But then there's one ringer group, and she does this in like 30 different countries. The group that was best off, based on one of her indicators, were older, poor, black Americans who were deeply religious. And when I asked her initially, she couldn't explain it. It's like, it's inconsistent with all the data. You know, as they say, don't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. So why are they doing okay? And these were self-interviews, as long as life longevity, not young African Americans, not middle-class African Americans, low-income African Americans, not people who went, and she said, when she did more research, she said, these people went to church on average 4 and 5 times a week. She said their religion wasn't something they did on Sunday, it's something they did every day. And they were in community every day. And that's what made them better off. And so, again, yes, they need a pot to piss in and a window to throw it out, but they also need community. They also need to belong. And to some extent, that's the fight in the United States and in Russia and in England. Who belongs? Who does not belong? It's not simply the Muslims are coming and they're going to take our stuff. What they say in Italy is that the Muslims are coming and they're going to take our identity. And that's the scariest thing of all. And we have to be able to talk about that in a way that there's a future. Because if we can't talk about that, there's no future. If we can't talk about that, then to some extent the right wing is right, and that is that we're going back to an imaginary past. And the problem with that imaginary past is it doesn't exist, which means we're going to oblivion.
Wow.
Anything else? Now I have a granddaughter. I don't want her to go to oblivion, so I'm depending on you guys to fix this mess. But I'm serious, but to fix the right mess. And the right mess is not a new iPhone or a new computer or a bigger house or a self-driving car. All those things are fine, maybe. But what we do need is a story and a practice and institutions and structures that reflect a more inclusive we. And a we that actually is multiple and fluid, can shift, and share. So, and if we can't do that, the fracture is not just outside, the fracture is inside. That is, if I can't integrate the different aspects of the world, it means I can't integrate the different aspects of myself. And I'll tell you a story and then I'll let you go. I had it in the book, and I wrote about this. I asked the students in Minnesota, I said, so let's do this exercise. And I said, and these are mainly white students, probably 95%. And I said, how many of you have ever dreamt you were an inanimate object or a species of a non-human species? And virtually everybody raised their hand. And then we went around the room and I said, tell me what you, and one person, I was an eagle and I was flying, and I was looking down, soaring. Another person, I was a stream and I was, flowing down the, and I was a fox and I was chasing the animal. I said, okay, great. And then I said, So how many of you have ever dreamt you were a black woman? No hands went up. Not one. And the students pushed back. And I said, wait a minute, does that strike you as odd? And they said, no, not at all. I said, why not? And they said, I'm not a black woman. And I said, you're not an eagle either. and what I was saying is that in their imagination, in their multiplicity, they could play with different identities. But even in their dreams, there was boundaries and segregation. So I challenged them, and we did some more exercise. And I said, and by the end of the year, virtually everybody had a dream that they were something else. And there was one student who called me like 5 years later and said, can I take you to lunch? And I said, sure. And he just said, you know, that was one of the most powerful exercises, and I just love that exercise. I said, great, great. And he said, and I just had a dream, and I haven't told anyone about it. I haven't told my wife or my therapist, but I want to tell you because you helped me have that dream. I said, what's that? And he said, I dreamt that I was gay, but I'm not. Right? So he was still struggling to me, and I said, you know, whatever. You know, it's like, you know, you probably are partially gay. It doesn't mean you practice it. It's just that you have the multiplicity. But he was struggling with even then, even when he had the dream, it was creating this tension for him, right? But he also sought me out. So it was important to him. It was important to share with somebody, not his wife. So I think as really healthy beings, first of all, I think healthy beings only exist in relationship to other healthy beings, that we don't exist in relationship alone, but that our multiplicity and diversity is both an internal and external project. And then we have to actually make structures and systems that actually help and support that in some way. So then we still need the other? I don't think so, but not necessarily. And I'll end just by telling you, one of my students here are very sharp. I know some of you from Berkeley, some of you are not, all of you are sharp, but one of my students said, you talk about this circle of, a belonging where everyone is included. He said, by definition, if you have a circle, isn't something outside of it? And I said, good question, but the answer is no. And the obvious example, circle, a sphere, is the universe. The universe is a sphere. There's nothing, at least by astrophysicists would say, there's nothing outside the universe, including nothing. All right, I'll let you guys go.